Good morning, class. All right, so I'm trying to get my camera situated. So here's the deal. I want to talk to you a little bit about the readings. You had several poems for today, and you also had Langston Hughes, the Negro. Let's see, the Negro artist in the Racial Mountain. So I want to go back to the Negro artist in the Racial Mountain for just a few minutes. First of all, I want to make sure that we're understanding exactly what Hughes is saying. And I think some of you are maintaining your understanding at a fairly superficial level. And that's the level of, that's not what I mean by that statement, or that's not what I would mean if I said that statement. But you've got to push past that, because even though Langston Hughes begins with an example of who we're going to assume is County Cullen, since this is a fairly famous debate or issue that they had with that they talked about. I want you to understand that he's only using that as an example to get into talking about other aspects in the essay. For example, what he really wants to talk about is what creates people's imagination of blackness, right? Why is blackness such a terrible thing? Why is being a Negro artist seen as something less than or inferior to being just an artist, which means by default being a white artist, right? So he begins by talking about the middle class black family. You remember the little line that says, they say to their children, don't be little niggers, right? And so, or look at how the white man does it, this kind of thing. So this kind of internalized sense of inferiority is really what he wants to engage. So he's going to give you several examples of that over the course of 3 or 4 paragraphs, in order to talk about really this the way black people see themselves has been internalized, and how that internalized oppression becomes an impediment to the creation of art. Art really must come from not only an intellectual place, but also a place here, a sense of yourself, a sense of the world, a kind of confidence that the way you are seeing the world is a worthy perspective. And so I want you to make sure when you read through this essay that you get that understanding, that you're not kind of stuck at, kind of this individual, I wouldn't say that, or I don't really think that way, or why do we have to be woke? You've missed the point in a way if that's where you're stuck. You need to see this as a broader cultural construct, a broader indictment of what internalized racism does to the artist. That's why he calls it the Negro artist in the racial mountain. So the racial mountain to get over is not the mountain of the oppressor, but it is the internal mountain created by oppression. All right. And we'll talk a little bit more about that on Tuesday. I want you to read through carefully that essay, and I want you to make some notes. And I also want you to, I'm going to have a little worksheet for you. This is just a notes guide worksheet where you can take notes and you can sort of begin to think about these particular aspects of the reading. Okay. So I want to talk a little bit about the poem. So you had a number of Langston Hughes poems to read. You had The Negro Speaks of Rivers. The Negro Speaks of Rivers was actually a poem written by Langston Hughes when he was about 18 or 19 years old. He was on a train, yes, 18 or 19. And a lot of people still consider it his greatest poem. He was on a train going to see his father. Langston Hughes was not raised by his mother and father. He was actually raised by his grandparents. His mother and father split up. His father had some very disparaging views of black people. He moved to Mexico, as a matter of fact, and Hughes is on the way to see his father. Later on, Hughes did go back to, his mother married again, and he did go to live with his mother, which becomes a really interesting thing too. But I want to talk about this poem The Negro Speaks of Rivers. This poem written when he was 18 years old, on a train, on the back of an envelope, as the story would go, or a piece of paper, a little piece of paper. And so he's looking out of this train river, and he begins to think. And I want you to sort of track what happens in the poem. Remember, part of the what was happening with these artists in the Harlem Renaissance is that they were myth making. They were trying to create a truer vision of what it meant to be a black person. And to be a black person was not to be an object, not to be this thing studied, as Alain Locke said, by the sociologists, the philanthropists. You know, it was to be a human being with all of the connections, the feelings, the ideologies of human beings. So he begins this poem, The Negro Speaks of Rivers. He says, I have known rivers. So I want you to think about, what does it mean when he says, I have known rivers? And who is the I? Is the I just Langston Hughes? Has Langston Hughes known all these rivers? He names the Nile, the Congo, the Euphrates, and then finally the Mississippi, right? So what is the I, or who is the I that he is talking about as he's talking about the Negro Speaks of Rivers? The other thing is, I want you to think about, what is the function of a river in culture, right? What is the function of a river? So we talk about the cradle of civilization being at the meeting of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. We talk about life along the Nile River. We talk about the Alabama River, right? Where cities grew up around the rivers. Where you find a city, it is very, very likely, in most instances, that you find a river. Even if it's a man-made river like the one in Los Angeles, the LA River, which is really just the canal, right? Water being siphoned off from a valley that has been decimated, but that's another story. Anyway, so the river is the cradle of civilization. So one of the things hurled at black people was that black people were brought to America and then civilized. And so the implication is that they had no civilization, they had no culture, they had no religion, they had no anything. They were just kind of these wild human beasts running about in the jungle, chucking spears and whatever, you know, the sort of Tarzan version of Africa. This is patently false. And so Hughes begins very simply, I have known rivers. And he begins to name all these ancient rivers. The other thing I want you to note about that poem are the activities that take place around those rivers. When we talk about the Congo, Congo was actually a site of all sorts of, what am I trying to say, witch doctor like foolishness that was propagated in print, in books, various types of books at the time. And so he takes the Congo from a scary, weird place to this place where I've pitched my hut and I've been lulled to sleep, a peaceful, wonderful place. So he starts with pre-European, before the Europeans came to the heart of Africa. He starts with that, and he starts with the people living on these rivers and doing all these wonderful things. Then he even moves to the Mississippi. And so the Mississippi becomes another important river in the history of the Africans, and in this case, the Africans in the Americas, because the Mississippi was the main conduit. One of the expressions is, you're going to be sold down the river. And to be sold down the river was a horrible thing, because it meant you went further down the river to deeper into the South. Also, the Mississippi ends in New Orleans, right? Where it empties into the Gulf of Mexico. And so this idea is that, and New Orleans became this hub where slaves were traded and dispersed to parts south. So it was kind of a horrible thing. It's also the site of all of these slaves being brought down the river to this place where they're auctioned along with cotton and all this other stuff as a kind of a horrible scene, a scene that really affects a writer like Walt Whitman and Abraham Lincoln, who both kind of see this and go, whoa, whoa, not a good thing, not a good thing. So that site, so he's even going to claim the Mississippi because the Mississippi too is a river that's important to our history. So we have the ancient rivers that have been part of our history from the beginning: the Euphrates, the Nile, the Congo, the et cetera, et cetera. And then we have the contemporary river, the Mississippi, which is the site of our sorrow here. And then he says, I have known rivers. My soul has grown deep like the rivers. So lots of implications there. The implications that I am a person with a soul. I'm also a person whose soul is ancient. I did not just get here. I have built civilizations before. I have risen and fallen. My civilization is older than really, or at the beginning of the dawn of time. So I want you to read through that. And I want you to think about the fact that an 18 or 19-year-old wrote this thing. This is an amazing poem that really enacts the entire history of the African American, but also makes that argument very, very firmly that we come from a great civilized people. We come from something ancient, as old as the world and the dawn of time. Amazing poem. Another poem that he talks about is Mother to Son. So one of the things I want you to see with this, with the Negro Artist in the Racial Mountain, with the poems that I've had you to read, Mother to Son, The Negro Speaks of Rivers, Theme for English B, Song for a Dark Girl, Christ in Alabama, all of those are very different types of poems. They have very, 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 very different ideas, rhythms, etc. The way Hughes became a published poet was he was working as a busboy, and he slips a couple of poems to a very prominent white poet by the name of Vachel Lindsay. And so Lindsay is responsible in part for Hughes getting published, and his first collection is called The Weary Blues. This is important because Hughes takes everything about African American culture and celebrates it. And so you can see why his argument is so important to him in The Negro Artist and the Racial Mountain. It's because all of these things that we take for granted, that we overlook, that are such a part and parcel of our culture, Hughes is arguing at every turn are not only important but beautiful. And he's not just making that argument, he's not even primarily making that argument to white people. He's making that argument to black people. Look at how beautiful you are. This is what he's trying to say in The Negro Artist in the Racial Mountain, that you have been taught not to see yourself as beautiful. But in Weary Blues, he uses the rhythms of blues. He uses jazz. He uses folks from the neighborhood. He uses all of these tools, all of these cultural touchstones in his arsenal in order to make art. So in Mother to Son, here he is using this conceit. And a conceit, as I told you before, is an extended metaphor. And the extended metaphor is a stairway. If we think about life as climbing a stair, right? This is what the mother is saying to the son. Son, I'll tell you, life for me ain't been no crystal stair. So the kind of stairs that we climb are different based upon our positionality. So for her, it's not a crystal stair. It's not beautiful. It's not glamorous. It's a stair with tacks in it and boards torn up, obstacles, all sorts of things that help you, that could lead to your tripping and falling. But she says that doesn't matter. I'm keeping climbing. And what she knows is the son's way is going to be easier. This is one of Hughes's most famous poems. People recite it all the time. Well, son, I'll tell you, life for me ain't been no crystal stair. And so this idea too that each generation makes it a little easier for the generation that comes after, right? And this advice that, don't sit down, don't give up, you keep climbing, because you're going to get there. You're going to get there. If you knew from where I came, you can certainly see that you're going to go higher. You're going to be more fabulous. It's going to be great. Okay. So the other poems in this I want you to think about are Song for a Dark Girl. This is important too because skin color, skin tone is also about positionality, but also about empathizing with the pain of Black people. So a lot of times Black people are looked at as not having, well, they're strong, they're tough, right? Things don't affect them like they affect everybody else. Christ in Alabama. Also, another poem about Black people surviving or not surviving under horrible racist conditions. So what does Christ look like? This is also this connection to these ideas that somehow being saved is a process of being whitened. But Christ is a nigger. That's what they're saying. Christ is someone who was vilified and then who was crucified, right? So we associate Christ with lynching in this poem. We associate Christ with false accusations, with poor treatment. And there's sort of this idea, I'm in good company, because if this is what folks did to Jesus, hey, right? And so this idea that people did not know who Christ was, right? If they really believed he was the Son of God, if they really thought he was the Son of God, how would they have treated him? So you read that poem and see how he connects this religious iconography. The other thing it calls out is this kind of Christianity that says, I love God, and yet, I treat people this way because of their skin color. So all of that stuff is wrapped up in there in this fairly simple, straightforward little rhyme. Theme for English B. This is another kind of poem. It's kind of free form, kind of moving. Hughes went to Barnard College, which is part of Columbia University, which is on the hill, really kind of overlooking Harlem to some extent. And so he's been asked to write a theme, about who he is. And he gets into identity politics. And what you think of me doesn't have anything to do with me, right? And how we are on this page, this white page, these Black words, we are wedded together. Theme for English B. It's a theme for identity. I'm writing to this teacher who, may not feel any kinship to me. But there is kinship, right? Because we are both human and we both are not what we may not be, or probably are not what we seem to be. Okay, I want to talk about, move on to County Cullen. We've talked a little about Cullen before. I told you Cullen was a brilliant student. He was went to integrated schools where he was one of few, very few Black people. To say integrated, we're not talking about 60-40 here. We're talking about, 403, right? So that kind of thing. So, but he was also a top student, always top of his class, very bright, brilliant, wrote tons and tons of poetry. And so I've given you three. Yet Do I Marvel, Incident, and to John Keats' poem, Poetic Springtime. So we know John Keats, you know who John Keats was. John Keats, romantic poet, British, died very young of tuberculosis, wrote beautiful lyrical romantic poetry, many odes to A Grecian Urn, Ode to Spring, etc. um, and also was doing something different, because the Romantic poets were sort of the rebels of their time. You know, they were doing their own thing, and a lot of people didn't like what Wordsworth. We think of them as old, you know, the old dudes, but a lot of people didn't like what they were doing, right? Because they changed the face of poetry. So he wants Countee Cullen wants to be a poet like Keats, right? But he doesn't want to recognize that, yeah, well, Keats is a white poet. Well, one of the reasons I give you this is that I want you to look at Yet Do I Marvel and Incident, and then sort of look at To John Keats, Poet at Springtime, and see which one speaks, which of these poems speaks to you the most. To me, Yet Do I Marvel it's a sonnet, first of all. Incident is a ballad, right? So he's using these classical forms, the ballad, the sonnet, in order to talk about things that have not been talked about in these classical poems. But here's the thing, and this is what Hughes would argue: all poetry is political. John Keats' poetry, even though it was not perhaps talking about specifically politics, is talking about quote unquote truth and beauty, these universal ideas, it too is political. Because every time you choose a subject, you are making a political choice. So Yet Do I Marvel takes this idea of, and I think this is something that Cullen himself grapples with. Yet do I marvel, basically he says, I don't doubt that God is good and kind, and that he does all these great things, right? But how can you make a poet black and bid him sing? Because what's in me to sing about is not going to be just truth and beauty, butterflies and puppies, right? Because what I see in the world is what I see in Incident. I'm riding in old Baltimore, heart filled, head filled with glee. And then I'm going to look at this little boy, and he's going to look back at me, and he's going to poke out his tongue and call me nigger. And that's all that I'm going to remember, right? So it's really hard to go and write about Ode to a Grecian Urn, like Keats wrote about, talking about how we are mortal, basically. How we are mortal, and how we will, youth only stays youthful in art, that we preserve that in art, but not in real life. In real life, we get old and we die. Incident, Yet Do I Marvel. I want you to just check those out. And I want you to think about how they are really the stronger of Countee Cullen's work, right? I think so. All right, so one more thing I want to tell you about Yet Do I Marvel. You have to go back to, I'm assuming that all of you have taken British Lit, and so you've studied the Romantics. So one of the echoes that you're going to hear in Yet Do I Marvel is Blake. And so if you remember Blake's, in his Songs of Innocence, Songs of Experience, and he's got a wonderful poem in there, Tiger, Tiger, Burning Bright. You know that poem? Okay. So Tiger, Tiger, Burning Bright. But it's the idea of, and he's got one called The Lamb. So the tiger and the lamb. And what Blake muses on is that the same hand that made the tiger made the lamb, right? So God is this fierce maker of things, right? And so the tiger, which is beautiful but also awful, and awful not in bad, but awful as in inspires one to awe. You know, have you ever seen a tiger? Its head is like this big, and they're very powerful and can sort of eat you with one bite. So you've got the tiger, and then you've got the lamb, this gentle little kind thing. The other thing is the lamb, in terms of the Lamb of God, right? This idea of the sacrificial lamb. And so God is the maker of all these things. So you have not only made me a poet and bid me sing, but you've made me a black poet. So what does that mean, God? What does that mean? So it's also trying to work out what kind of God has created a people and a people underneath that who do fairly terrible things to each other, right? Why is there oppression? Why is there racism? Why is there all this kind of sickness and sadness in the world? Okay, so I want you to go through those poems, and what I'm going to post to Blackboard is a kind of, it's not quite a study guide. Let's say it's a reading guide, because I don't want you to miss some of the salient points of these readings. I want you to begin to read carefully, because one of the things your test showed me is that you're reading, some of you are reading, some of you aren't reading. Well, let's just be honest. Some of you are not reading. I don't know, you turning pages or skimming or just coming to class and listening to the discussion. You need to get to reading. But I also want you to read actively and carefully. And I think we need a few reading lessons about how we read this literature at a higher level. I was very generous in the points, but we're going to get to a higher level of answer and a deeper understanding of these things. Okay. All right, so you've got coming up the ethics of living Jim Crow. Let me talk about the ethics of living Jim Crow. Ethics of living Jim Crow, Richard Wright. So ethics, of course, is ironically used here. And he's going to take you through a series of incidents, I guess, in his life. Maybe they happened to him, maybe they're composite. I'm not real sure about that. But supposedly they happened to him. And so we'll take him at his word. But in it, we see what happens when, even though we're after slavery, remember Jim Crow is basically a 20th century invention in order to keep people in their place. So how can you have ambition? In order to get a library book, he has to forge a note from his white boss, and he has to write it in the way that he thinks his boss would write it. You know, let this little nigger boy have some books, and he needs to sign it. And then I want you to understand that he checks out books by H.L. Mencken. H.L. Mencken was a writer, essayist, newspaper, etc., who just skewered the South and its Jim Crow segregation and its backwards ways, etc., etc. And so this is a very important person for Wright to read, because Mencken takes the South to task, deconstructs it, breaks it down, makes you see it in a way that you have not seen it before. And so this opens Wright's eyes, and then this leads to more reading, which continues to open his eyes, and he realizes that what he is a part of is not the natural order of things, which is what the Southern tradition said, that way, you know, this is just the natural order of things, but that he was living in a oppressive society, a society that was designed to be oppressive in order to maintain the status quo, which means certain people in power and certain people not in power. Certain people would remain at the bottom rung of a society in order to work for the others. And then I want you to also notice what is able to be done to black bodies and the reaction of other black people to these incidents. For example, when he is cut and has to be taken to the hospital because the white boys are throwing these cinders, and you know the cinders are these pieces of I think cinder brick at him. His mother beats him. Why does she beat him? Why does she beat him? That's the question I want you to answer. Why does she beat him? Is she just being cruel, or is she being practical? All right. When the woman is assaulted, basically right in front of him, basically sexually harassed, assaulted, why does he not say anything? Right? When the woman is beaten because she can't pay her bill, and then arrested when she stumbles out for public drunkenness, even though she's really just been assaulted by these people, and there's no recourse. And how do you see some of these same kinds of ideologies working out in the newspaper right now, or in television right now, or in what's happening right now? Because I see some patterns that seem to be repeating themselves. So the ethics of living Jim Crow. All right, happy reading. Think about those poems. I'm just going to put a little assignment sheet up there where it's just kind of prompting you of the way to read through these things. Okay? See you Tuesday.